Tonight with Anna Minton, author of The Big Capital, Who is London For? We discuss the horror of the fire at Grenfell Tower in London on Tuesday night and the factors that brought it about, or at least allowed it to happen. Also the Irish housing crisis. We discuss how Simon Coveney fled from a challenge he professed to relish and how a neophyte, Owen Murphy, can be expected to cope with it. With us now are Anna Minton, author of Big Capital, Who is London For? Kitty Holland, social affairs correspondent with the Irish Times, and Rory Hearn, sociologist at NUI Maynooth. Joining us later for a preview of tomorrow morning's newspapers are Ona Murrico, broadcaster at the Shorter, chief arts writer with the Sunday Times. On the tweet machine this evening is Juliet Gash, senior reporter with Today FM. If you'd like to comment on the programme, you can text us at 53131, place the word tonight before a comment, send us a tweet at #B or email us at tonight@tv3.ie. Some of the British newspapers tonight are forecasting that the death toll from the Grenfell Tower inferno may exceed over 100. One of our contributors last night called it the terrorism of austerity. Others might think of it as the price ordinary mortals pay for a world ruled by capitalism. Anna, what do you think it is?
I think you're right about that, but actually it's a complicated picture. What this has been is a total failure of democratic accountability. Residents and tenants had warned for years that this was an accident waiting to happen. The local residents' action group had actually written on a blog that it won't be until there is a catastrophic fire in this block that we are actually listened to. The tenants' management organisation, the private company which runs housing in the borough of Kensington and Chelsea, 10,000 homes, had received 8 major warnings of fires. There have been fires in other towers in the borough. I mean, it's a complete failure of accountability on the part of that organisation, which is responsible for all of these 10,000 homes. And this is a result, essentially, of the privatisation of social housing in the UK. So in that respect, it's directly linked to, an extreme sort of form of capitalism which has permeated our housing by stealth, really.
Why should houses that are built by the private sector be any more vulnerable to this kind of disaster than houses built by the public sector?
It's not that the homes are more vulnerable. It's the problem really is with the fact that residents' concerns were not listened to. The private sector can build perfectly decent homes, but when residents say, you're putting a boiler in an unsafe place and nobody listens to that, when you're not doing the repairs that you need to do and nobody listens to that, that's when you start to see the problems. Another issue with this particular tower, as you may well have heard, is that it had recently been refurbished with this cladding, and that hadn't, that seems to be the main cause of why the fire had spread so quickly. And actually, it's also, as well as a failure of accountability, it's a failure of regulation, because our building regulations in the UK are some of the weakest in the world. And despite repeated calls for building regulations to be reviewed following a previous very similar fire in 2009, the housing minister didn't review building regulations. Incidentally, this same housing minister, Gavin Barlow, is now Theresa May's special advisor.
You said that there had been other fires in some of the tower blocks in the same borough. How serious were they?
They were not anything like this. I mean, they didn't spread, but, there were very, very serious concerns about this organisation, to the point where I read, actually, that I believe a member of the board that runs this organisation stepped down. I think a previous chair had stepped down because their concerns were not being listened to. I've read that another board member who was expressing so many concerns was basically told, if she didn't stop, she would be kicked off the board. I mean, it's been a complete failure of accountability.
You said that Britain has one of the most lax regulations in respect of housing, but even given the regulations that do exist there, were they monitored? were public officials examining?
Well, I think the issue is that the building passed the regulations. When it was refurbished, just really very recently, I think last year, all the work was done according to building regulations. But actually, this new cladding wouldn't have passed possibly regulations if they had been reviewed, because we know now, I think it's emerging that similar fires in Dubai, in China, with cladded buildings have occurred. So this would have been flagged up.
When you think of the alarm that was expressed in Britain over terrorist attacks over the last while, and by no measure have the recent terrorist attacks come to anything like the carnage that has happened in this place, one wonders what priorities are, but also one wonders whether we give oxygen to terrorism by the hyping that we make of various incidents. But this is far worse than any terrorist atrocity that has happened in recent years.
I mean, it's absolutely appalling. I mean, I'd be reluctant to compare, you know, sort of terrible events. You know, the Manchester atrocity was terrible. This is absolutely terrible. You know, you can't really sort of say, you know, one is worse than another. This is absolutely horrific because it was so easily preventable. You know, residents had repeatedly warned about it. If the company that runs housing in Kensington and Chelsea was doing its job properly, it needn't have happened. That is what is so terrible.
Let me just explain, because it might be misunderstood what I said there, that terrorists engage in these appalling atrocities for the purposes of terrifying not just the people whom they attack, but an entire community. And to a large extent, the media and the political establishment collaborate with the terrorists in causing terror, in hyping the scale of the atrocities and the significance of the atrocities, and that far more damage is done to people's lives, not by terrorists, but by capitalism.
Well, I mean, I couldn't agree with you more, but, you know, the media, especially the British media, to speak ill of some of my colleagues, I've been a journalist as well.
Oh, please, free to do that, yeah.
You know, they're very much part of that story.
Yeah. Kitty, do you have any observations on this? It's just horrific. When you see the film of people up at windows and high up on these towers,
just stuff of
begging for help and throwing out babies, and
that really, you know, one can only conclude that they died because they were poor. I mean, we talk about the lack of investment and the lack of regulation and bad quality public housing in Britain, and we've seen the horrific impact of that. But, you know, it exists here too. Maybe, obviously, people haven't died in these horrific numbers in Ireland, but I've been into many local authority flats and houses here, and they're riddled with damp and mould and rotting and fire hazards and cold and damp, and the impact on the people who live there, who complain again and again and again about their living conditions to their landlord, who is the local authority. And they're told it's their fault, and they're told that the mould and the damp is their fault, and they're told that they're not looking after, you know, their living environment properly. And these are people who are paying rent, but they're with no disposable income, no money to invest in their dwellings, and the impact on their health. I mean, there's a case before Europe on the case from a human rights perspective on local authority housing here, which we're expecting a judgment in a couple of months, but on the grounds of impact on their health, impact on their right to life, impact on their right to an education, their impact on the right to work, impact on their family life and their privacy, and all these things. You know, your home is a place that should be safe, that should be warm, that should be a place where you can be healthy and thrive, and the level of overcrowding. I was in a flat in Mercer Street yesterday, 6 people living in a 2-bedroom flat full of mould. The baby's cot is full of mould. The baby has kidney problems. She has told the council over and over again for the last 3 years about the mould in the flat, and she's not listened to, told it's her
Did
fault.
she get up early in the morning?
Well, it's, you know, so we're seeing we have the same story here, and that people who are poor, who have less economic leverage, who have less political leverage, are ignored, and their lives are impacted, their health is impacted, and their lives are cut short. And
we had, of course, a terrible tragedy. Tragedy doesn't capture it adequately, but a conflagration here, but nothing like the scale in London. In Carrick Mines a number of years ago, where 10 travellers, and many of them children, died in
October
a terrible
2015,
fire. Died in a terrible fire. And that was because of the way we treat travellers generally.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was two families on a site in Carrick Mines where the local authority, Dunleary Rathdown County Council, had put them there as an emergency measure about 8 years previously. It was an unauthorised site. They didn't have proper electricity or toilet facilities, and ultimately they didn't have proper distance between the dwellings they were living in, and the fire spread from one to the other. At least, the family feel at least 2 of them died because of that, because the fire spread to the next, the baby and the infant, one of the young children. Again, neglect by a local authority, arguably.
We obviously had as well, we had Priory Hall. We've had, issues with the quality of private sector construction. As Kitty said, I worked for many years with that community, Dolphin House, in terms of their social housing and highlighting the conditions and seeing the conditions that local authority residents were living in. And it did come back to the lack of investment, the withdrawal of funding from local authorities to be able to manage, maintain their estates. And the problem with so it's 2 things. One is kind of this withdrawal by the state from investing in social housing, maintaining it, which leaves these issues. But the other issue you asked about privatisation, and why does the private sector, mean worse conditions or these things might happen? And it's basic bottom line, it's profit. It's cheaper not to respond to these things.
What the public sector has done in hospitals, for instance, and it's been pretty appalling. And
so it's not
appalling record in that area.
Absolutely, the public sector does, and there's major issues, as I just said, in terms of council housing not been managed properly. I think within the local authorities and the public sector, the issue is one of lack of funding, but also a lack of an accountable system. Bureaucracies that don't respond to people's need, and reflection of wider institutional values that don't prioritise poor people, don't prioritise the vulnerable. But then in the private sector, the issue is that profit. And this is what happens when you leave housing in the hands of profit providers, that safety isn't prioritised.
Anna, tell us a bit about your book.
Well, it's called Big Capital, Who is London For? And the big capital of the title obviously is a play on words. It refers to London, and it refers to the huge amount of global capital which has flooded into the city, particularly since the financial crisis, and has seen house prices in London soar to some of the highest in the world outside of Monaco.
In Dublin.
And perhaps Dublin. Yeah. And the argument of the book actually is that this influx of huge wealth at the top is linked to the terrible conditions we're seeing in housing at the bottom, and how we are seeing the emergence of London as this city of, utterly unaffordable city in the centre, and then, terrible conditions in private renting, terrible conditions in certain housing, as, Grenfell fire sort of indicates. A situation which actually has become particularly acute just in the last 10 years.
OK, we're going to take a break. After the break, we'll talk about the Irish housing crisis. Join us then. Julia, tell us about Twitter.
Yes, indeed, Vincent. People are fairly exercised on Twitter this evening. Brian Hodge is saying that can any figures issued by the government be believed, from leprechaun economics, homelessness, trolleys to the unemployed? The janitor says, using the hashtag VinB, how many TD landlords are spending as little as possible on safety issues so they can enrich themselves at the expense of poor people? Jason Michael is agreeing with Kitty Holland, saying we can only conclude that they died because they were poor. You're absolutely right, he says. And Gordon is saying exactly what I was thinking in reference to your comments, Vincent, about what all Leo would like to know is, do they get up early in the morning? The janitor says that Corbyn spoke to people while May hid from the people and the media during her private visit. I know there's lots of coverage on that on Twitter today. Declan Cuff was making the point that Grenfell Tower disaster was an example of what happens when people's needs are disregarded, saying it's heartbreaking yet preventable. Some interesting ones here as well. John Fitzpatrick saying in the 80s or 90s, cladding Ballymun was on the Dublin City Council agenda, and he says he played a part in making sure it did not happen because, of course, as Frank Doherty is pointing out, that the cladding was added as the tower was seen as an eyesore for rich neighbours. This is the cladding on the Grenfell Tower building. How tragically ironic. And Andrew Brennan says that the countdown to the end of neoliberalism on these islands began when Grenfell Tower went up in flames. Edward Smith makes the point that it reminds him of stardust. Back to you.
Okay, tomorrow there's a conference in Croke Park, I think, run by the agency Task, and it's dealing with the scale of inequality in Ireland. But Rory Hearn has written a paper on this in relation to housing. Tell us what the salient points of your paper are.
Well, I suppose the salient points are that the housing inequalities, we've had inequalities in the Irish housing system for many decades, and in particular we think of disadvantaged areas like Ballymun, like Limerick, parts of Limerick, places that have been excluded from housing, suffered from poor conditions. But people, travellers, people with disabilities have been excluded. But the scale of inequalities in the Irish housing system, my analysis and research has shown in the past kind of 5 to really since the crash is really anything beyond what we've seen. If we think of in terms of the most, our own humanitarian disaster here, which is homelessness, that we're, in terms of numbers, we're at record numbers of homelessness. While at the same time you have, 5,000 extra millionaires last year. We have, we're now 4 years into an economic recovery, yet we have between 60 to 70 families becoming homeless every month. And that is kind of the really extreme end of inequality in the housing system. But the housing crisis is also affecting generational inequality. So we have this significant reduction in the level of home ownership in Ireland. Ireland had the biggest fall in home ownership rates over the last 10 years in Europe. We're back to now levels of home ownership that we had in the 1970s. And in particular, it's young people, and it's young people and lower income people where home ownership rates have dropped. And that means they haven't got social housing. Where they've gone to is the private rental sector. So they're increasingly reliant on the private rental sector. And the problem with that is it's an insecure form of housing, as in landlords can evict people quite easily. And that's been the major factor cause of the homelessness. But also we have the issue of increasing rents. Rents have increased almost over 60% since the trough of 2013. They're now higher than they were in 2008. So we have major issues of affordability that mainly affects young people, or younger generations, people under 40. And also my analysis shows that the policies that have been enacted by successive governments since 2008 have reinforced and worsened inequality.
Yeah, one of the points you made, which I'm surprised about, you're saying that the Simon Coveney's plan, Rebuilding Ireland, actually has made things worse.
Yeah.
That seems bizarre.
Yeah. Well, it's quite straightforward if you think about it. The numbers there are the majority of social housing to come from Rebuilding Ireland are actually coming from the private sector. So they're not new build local authority or housing association housing. Where they're coming from is the rental sector, the private rental sector. So we have the state using the private rental sector to get social housing. That increases demand in the private rental sector, which increases rents further. The other area they're doing is buying housing. So they're competing with people, first-time buyers, people trying to buy housing from the private market, which leads to increased prices. But the biggest area that I've analysed in terms of how the housing policy by the government, and it's linked to the economic policy, has worsened the housing crisis, is bringing in what Anna referred to, the big capital, big investors, the private equity funds, the real estate investment trusts, the vulture funds into Ireland since 2008 to try and buy up the property, take it off the banks. So we have vulture funds now owning 6% of mortgages. The largest landlord in Ireland now is a real estate investment trust. We've only had real estate investment trusts since 2014. They introduced tax breaks. We had twice the amount of housing bought in the first 4 months of this year by investors than by first-time buyers. So what has happened is they've further commoditized or made housing more of an asset for investors and speculators. And what their strategy has been, rather than build affordable housing, it has been to incentivize private sector supply, which has mean the government has actively gone about facilitating rising rents by bringing in investors and allowing house prices increase, and on the idea that this would increase supply. But what's happened with private sector supply? It's flatlined. Nothing has happened because they're hoarding land, they're waiting for prices to rent further. The government could actually solve this crisis. No, I just want to make one point, because the government could have solved this crisis 2 years ago, a year ago. It could solve the homelessness crisis in a year if the Minister for Housing turned around to the local authorities and said, you have limitless money to build 2,000 rapid houses in a year, do it. It could have the
limitless money. Well, of course. Yeah.
No, but limited in terms of they only have 300 million at the moment for capital expenditure. If they tripled that to $1 billion, they could solve that. That's not a major money in terms of the amount of money the state takes in.
And Simon Coveney has said money's no problem. He
The
said
state
money's
could
no
solve
object.
this within a year, but they don't want to. The second thing they could do to solve the wider housing crisis is set up an Irish semi-state housing company like the ESB delivered electricity to build affordable housing for a range of income people, and it could build 10 to 20,000 houses. But why won't they do it, Vincent? Why won't they do it?
Because I suppose they think that the more efficacious way of going about it is to rely on the private sector to build more houses. I assume they did, because in the Celtic Tiger era, the private sector built a huge number of houses, and many of those are lying empty at present. So, and I assume the argument is that if you had that kind of energy again in the private sector, we could solve the housing crisis.
And it is a basic misunderstanding of what has happened since the crash. The Irish property sector is bust, it is broken. They can't borrow finance, the banks aren't there to lend them. The only money that's coming into this country, into property, is private equity funds, the top 1% of wealth in the world. And so that's the point.
Why do we care where the money comes from?
Because the point is that builders are not in a position to build. Developers can't develop because they don't have the finance, because they're not there. The only way we can guarantee an increase of provision of housing is the state to do it. That is the only way we will do it.
But it's also a misunderstanding of the issue, which we have exactly the same thing happening in London and other big cities, which is that the private sector is building homes, but they are not building homes for ordinary families, ordinary people who need them. They're building them for foreign investors. And they're just simply assets. So, you know, building is happening, but we have a lot of luxury apartments which are just empty, you know, while we have this huge housing crisis. I suspect you've probably got the same.
Well, if the luxury apartments are empty, if there are a large number of luxury apartments empty in London, then the rental costs of luxury apartments must be very low.
Well, no, not at all, because the market just simply isn't operating properly, because investors don't really want them primarily for the rental. They want them just simply for the land that they sit on, for the property, for the value of the land and the property. They're safety deposit boxes in the sky. That's how they've been described.
They're also trophy homes.
The market
they're trophy
is
homes
not,
as well.
it's utterly broken.
There are homes in Dublin, which, I mean, I have a friend who's a builder. He's brought me to some of them around Dublin. He brought me to one he's doing at the moment in the city centre with the best of everything is going into it. It's got 3 bathrooms, it's got 5 bedrooms, it's got a wine cellar, it's got... And I said, well, it's going to be amazing. There must be 20 people living here. He said, oh, no one will live here.
But Vincent,
this will be somewhere he'll come and stay when he's in Dublin. And there's lots of these houses all over. Meanwhile, there's 6 people in a 2-bed down the road.
The answer to the question that I asked you, I believe, is, number one, they are absolutely captured by this private market belief. They believe the market works. The market, as Anna explained, doesn't provide housing, affordable housing, because it's not profitable. The core argument developers, the construction industry are making right now is housing is still not profitable. That unless housing prices go over 300,000 or 350,000, if we look at, for example, the sale of land by RTE that just happened, disgraceful sale of public land, I calculated that if on the basis of that sale and the projected number of apartments, you're talking about 200,000 per apartment just on the land alone. So in terms of the construction, you put it, so no property is going to be sold there for under 500,000. The homes that are being built, whatever limited number, whatever limited increase there will be in coming years, will only be built for high-income people by the private sector. If we want affordable homes, the state has to do it. And it is because the Kennedy Wilsons, for example, they've lobbied.
It's RTE's fault. OK, let's blame the housing crisis on RTE. We'll take a break and we'll get to talk about RTE more after the break. Join us then. Julie, what are people saying on the tweets and texts?
Well, Anne Hayden says that class is alive and kicking, hashtagging Vin B and Grenfell Tower. Along that theme is Patrick Monks, who says that a report in London 3 years ago said that London had 2,789 streets with every house worth more than 1 million, reflects sickness in society. Paul Anderson says it's time that you got a couple of homeless people on your show to question Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil on their terrible record and how to fix it now. Brian Flanagan is saying that Coveney's solution to the housing crisis depended on the private sector leasing and giving HAP, that's the housing assistance payment, cash to landlords. Owen Murphy must do better, he says, hashtag VinB. Simon says it's difficult to disagree with much of what Rory Hearn says this evening. But on the other side, we have Francis saying that ex-Socialist Workers' Party Rory Hearn turns important discussions into a private sector bashing commie love-in. Where's the balance, Vincent? There's a couple of people giving out about lefties on the show, but we also have people saying lefties making sense, as though that's utterly impossible.
Change,
lefties with brains, says Patrick Monks.
When last did lefties make sense?
Tonight, apparently. Dolly White says, well done, Rory. Brilliant analysis on housing. Someone else is suggesting that he run for office.
And he's planning that, yeah. He's going to run for the Labour Party next time.
Someone else is saying that the housing crisis in Ireland may end up with a Grenfell-type disaster. Hashtag VinB. That's what happens when people are treated like trash. Back to you.
OK, just before we go on, I want to just pay tribute to a few people who died recently. Anne-Louise Gilligan, obviously, Catherine Sapona's partner. She apparently did a lot of really good work out in the Tala area where the two of them live. I didn't know her personally, but I did know Jack Finucane, who was one of the founders of Concern. And he was involved in Concern when the Biafra War happened in the late 1960s. And they organised relief efforts for Biafra at the time. And they've also done, Concern's done great work all over the world. And Jack Finucane was a prime mover in all of that. And the other person I just want to mention is Fred Cogley, who was an avuncular, lovely, clever and able rugby commentator. And those of us who are interested in rugby over the years remember him very fondly indeed. All right, let's get back and talk about the housing thing. And just one other thing, that blaming particular people, I think, like Leah Varadkar or whatever, I think misses the point. It's politics, it's their politics or whoever's politics that matters, not these people personally, because they're no less concerned about public welfare than anybody else, including lefties.
I think that's arguable.
I'm sorry?
I think that's arguable.
Right.
Well, the greater public good. I mean, there's some people who are concerned about, the greater public good in general, and there's some people who are concerned about sections of the public. And
well, I think that generally politicians believe they're acting in the general public good, but.
Well, we can never forget Margaret Thatcher's famous phrase, "There's no such thing as society." I mean, that really was the sort of underpinning of a massive shift to individualism.
Yeah, all right. But I think that Margaret Thatcher believed that she was acting in the public good in asserting that. And a lot of us will disagree with it.
But isn't that the point, though, that they might believe that they are?
Yeah, all right.
And you were right to say it's not a personal thing and we shouldn't personalise it. But it is the person or the Taoiseach or the minister that carries those values and approaches. And I think it would be fair to say that the dominant approach within Fine Gael within, you know, the mainstream parties is one of, and mainstream institutions is one that it actually sees a lot of these problems as being caused by the people themselves rather than the actual system. And
but
the way
also
in
they
which the
believe
system is
that
organised.
they believe that the market system is best able
It's
to
the best
regulate
way
all
to
this.
allocate resources, is the best way to organise society.
And that's a genuine conviction on their part. You may disagree with it, but it's genuine conviction. Pardon?
But surely it's, you know, at this stage, after the kind of banking collapse and the crash of the world's economic collapse, it has been shown to be an absolute failure.
But it doesn't seem to have changed very many opinions in very many governments and institutions.
But I think
these lefties who come on this program all the time, they don't ever refer to what happened in Russia under communism and the gulags and the people who were slaughtered by communists and other lefties during all that time. So,
I think the response to that is that just because one system is failing and other systems have failed, just shouldn't mean we just have to accept the way things are. That clearly, the point is that I think that there is a change happening, though, that people are seeing that the dominant policies, market policies, neoliberal policies that have been followed over the last 30 years that have caused the crisis, caused this increase in inequality, they're questioning it. And the support for Corbyn is an example of that process of change.
And they're questioning it in other ways and going to the right. I mean, they're questioning it in other ways and going to the populist right. Just look at Trump.
Okay. Just to personalise it again, I think it's disappointing that Simon Coveney, who I think is a genuine guy, and was committed to doing something about housing, after a year, or is it a year or a year and a half?
Just over a year. He brought out his Rebuilding Ireland in June last year.
Then scarpers off to the Department of Foreign Affairs. Yes, there are big issues to do with Department of Foreign Affairs, and Brexit is a big issue for us there. But he had the momentum going, or he had acquired a certain expertise in housing. And it's a great pity he just didn't stay there and try to finish the job.
We now have the 5th housing minister in 6 years, which really, you know, we've had Willie Penrose, Jan O'Sullivan, Alan Kelly, Simon Coveney, and now we have Owen Murphy. And, you know, to see that, you know, Simon Harris was left.
How about Damien English? You forgot about Damien English.
Well, Damien English is a junior minister.
So was the others. Willie Penrose was a junior minister.
Well, he was a minister for how, but in terms of a minister who was concentrating on housing, yes, we had Willie Penrose and Jan O'Sullivan. Well, and Paudie Coffey as well, but Paudie Coffey was on construction, whereas Alan Kelly was on social housing. But I mean, you know, Simon Harris was left in health, and Richard Bruton was left in education. Obviously, very important briefs. And to see again a change. And Owen Murphy's first statement today says he's going to have an urgent review of Rebuilding Ireland, which means it stalls again.
Well, Richard Bruton wanted to stay in education, and he wanted education when the government changed, or when the new government came into office after the election last year. And I think that he used to be, like, you might disagree with some of the policies he pursues in education, but he's a genuine commitment to it.
But that's my point, doesn't it speak to how committed people really are about housing? So when you look at things like education and health, that these are really important issues that affect...
Can I just jump in to say...
You've never heard of these luminaries,
but it's exactly the same in, you know, in England. We've had 3 housing ministers since 2015. I mean, I think, you know, housing is an unloved issue, and the reason is because it's actually poor housing.
Okay, but you have Boris Johnson. We don't have Boris Johnson, so you're
but
so
Vincent,
much better off.
I think part of the reason that he is leaving is because he has failed. The policies have failed.
I know,
Simon Coveney. But like, I think that there is that. Like, if we look at rebuild, their targets for last year were to build 2,000 social housing units. They only built 650. They promised the families that they were all going to be out of the hotels by the end of this month. They're not going to be out.
The SRI says they've got to build 30 to 35,000 houses a year in order to rectify the situation. We're nowhere near that. All right, we've got to leave it there, and we take another break. After the break, we get to preview tomorrow morning's newspapers. Join us. Sheila, tell us about the texts and tweets.
Angus O'Muelon is saying there are lots of new builds, in Dublin West. Way too many enormous 5 beds in gated estates. Practically nothing for the first-time buyers market. Thanks, Simon, he says. Garrett Mullen is saying also, please, no more emergency B&B or hubs or HAP payments or any other such bull measures. Real houses need building. Political Irish is saying social housing shouldn't be for life. It should be a temporary fix, better incomes and supports needed to help people in their own home. While Larry Dunn on the other side says, do lefties believe folk are entitled to be housed by the state at the expense of others? There's definitely a lefty-righty bias on the tweet machine this evening. Peter Maguire is saying, again, Vin B gets it. We don't want constant debates between opposing sides. We get 3 great panellists and we get to hear them. Carl says, already having a review of rebuilding Ireland, another 12 months down the drain. More praise for Rory Hearn and his and his comments tonight. He's saying, unfortunately, Declan Cuff is saying, unfortunately, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael lack the ability to enact common sense policies. And Gary Egan is saying homelessness is a government policy. It's market manipulation to boost the bankrupt banks' balance sheets. It's effing policy. And Jamie Hogan says, at least Coveney won't have to suffer the embarrassment of his deadline failure. And Owen Murphy can set another deadline and then do nothing. #WinB.
Okay, by the way, we made many efforts throughout the day to get representative of Fine Gael to come on the programme this evening, but none of them are available. I suppose they were all celebrating last night. Well, they weren't all celebrating Leo Coveney, did I say that? Leo Varadkar's success. Okay, we're joined by Ethna Shortall, chief arts writer with the Sunday Times, and Owen Morrico, broadcaster and another lefty. Let's go to the front pages of the newspapers. Start with the front page of the Irish Times. May orders fire inquiry as demand for answers grows. Also here, ministers uneasy at how Whelan was nominated. That's Mary Whelan, the Attorney General, who was nominated to the Court of Appeal, without any of the normal procedures applying in that case. Down here, call for legal charity on polygamous families. In the Examiner, Attorney General was privy to talks on her new position. Also here, returning jihadi fighters pose risk, and whistleblowers HSE trying to cut out conclusions, and 6 bodies recovered from Grenfell in long process. In the Ireland edition of the London Times, DUP pact is playing fast and loose with peace, Adams warns, and Varadkar silent over nomination of top judge, and Claddagh in Tower Block was ruled unsafe by US. In the journal.ie, London Tower Block fire must serve as a wake-up call to Ireland, and also in the journal, plight of teenager left lying in a hospital for weeks, brought to a high court. All right, obviously the story about the judge, by the point of Mary Whelan, the appointment of Mary Whelan to the Court of Appeal, is becoming quite an issue, and understandably so.
Well, we're supposed to be having new politics and an end to the cronyism of the past and new procedures. And it's very, very clear that this is the old system at its worst. There was a position where if you were an Attorney General, you automatically had call on the first
No, there was
vacancy.
not. That was not it.
Well,
that
in
was
practice,
not,
it wasn't in theory. But in practice,
Attorney General never had call on things. Many of them
always
got
got
appointed. No, not always, no.
well, usually they got it. But what we have
Like
here,
the last few didn't.
I think
For instance, Paul Gallagher wasn't appointed to the High Court.
some of them didn't want
And
it. but-
Rory Brady wasn't appointed to the High Court. Dermot Leeson wasn't appointed to the High Court.
I think
So,
the two
any
important
of the
points
three
in
of them
this
wanted to
are
be, they would have been.
that the Attorney General was actually involved in the room while this was being discussed. That is quite wrong. She should have recused herself, as the phrase goes. And the other interesting part is that Dennis Naughton, the minister from the independent group, he says that this was not presented with a list of potential candidates, that it didn't conform to the policy which the government is supposedly committed to, and that he intends to raise it again at the next government meeting. So I don't think this is an issue which is going to go away, but it is interesting, the Times position, Varadkar's silent over this nomination. Whether he'll be allowed to stay silent on it for very much longer is, I think, in question.
Ethel, do you want to talk about that, or do you want to talk about the polygamist?
Yeah, polygamy, my favourite subject. No, that story caught my eye. I thought it was interesting because, it's one man taking a case that was a condition of his first wife, who was a second wife to come to Ireland, a condition of her being allowed in and getting status here was that he would take this case. And so he's taken it, and now they have found that his first marriage is actually the one that Ireland recognises, and the second one we don't recognise, but at the same time they're saying that doesn't mean that it won't come up that she's entitled to certain rights. And I just think it's interesting that it now has repercussions for the whole country and for the chance that this could well happen again, come up again. And basically they're saying in court today that the government will have to legislate for polygamy. I mean, it's like...
If the second wife is his partner nowadays...
They're both his partner nowadays.
Well, the first wife is in wherever...
She's here now.
Oh, the two wives are here now. Oh, I see.
But the one he married second, but who came to Ireland first, is recognised as his wife here. The first wife who came here second was allowed entry in 2003 or 2004, but only on the basis that he was going to take this to the High Court and it was going to be a legal challenge. So that's why she was allowed in. So this has to happen. Although that was 12, 13 years ago, which shows you obviously how slowly these things move.
Mm. It is important that both women are supported and protected in their rights, because if one of the women is not protected in law, she's going to be extremely vulnerable in terms of, you know, having somewhere to live, having an income, being supported, all that
being
kind of
able
thing.
to stay.
Well, she would have been deported if she hadn't.
So yeah, but I mean, it would leave the unrecognised wife extremely vulnerable. So this is an issue of, I suppose, protecting women. This is a woman's issue. I would say it's as much a woman's issue as it is a man's right, you know.
And both of the women have children by him as well, so it affects the decision for the kids as well.
Tricky one.
Mm. I mean, I don't think it's going to come up that often, but obviously it can come up again.
Who's the judge with all this? Must do his or
Mr. Justice Frank Clark.
Iseult O'Malley.
Who was it? Iseult O'Malley, yeah.
And this is on the Supreme Court then, yeah?
Yeah.
Oh, God.
You could take a second wife, Vincent.
Pardon?
You could take a second wife.
But see, one of the problems with polygamy is that women can't take a second husband, you know? So
No, that would be polyandry.
OK, well, I haven't seen that come up in the court.
They have it in Tibet, apparently, or used to.
All right, what other stories do you want to talk about?
Well, I think the one about the whistleblowers on the HSE issue, and they're making the point that the HSE, according to the whistleblowers, is attempting to cut out the conclusions of the report from being published, so that we will have, if you like, a look at the beginnings of the story, but we won't see the full report. And in their argument that this is an attempt by the HSE to try and cover up, blur, confuse the issues involved in this story, which relates to the Grace story, the treatment of this young woman, the concerns that were expressed, the whistleblowers who brought this out. And it is interesting that at this time, when we have all this nonsense about new politics, we still have
Tell Anna about the Grace story.
Well, she was for many years under the supervision of the social services here. She was put into a foster family. Known allegations were made that there was serious physical abuse, that there was a possibility of sexual abuse, and she was left there for, what, 20 years. And the eventual demand of the whistleblowers that this matter be rectified, that she had certain mental issues of capacity. When they were demanding that this be rectified, according to themselves, they were stymied, prevented at every turn, and they say that this report from the HSE, essentially what their argument is that it's a cover-up.
OK, Ethel, do you want to focus on any other story?
Yeah, the story in the Times Ireland edition about the DUP pact with Theresa May, and basically Jerry Adams and Sinn Féin in general are saying that by forming a possible deal with the Tories and the DUP, that Theresa May is playing fast and loose with her government's commitment in the Good Friday Agreement to be impartial, which I think is a valid point. I mean, I don't know if it stands up, but it's one, for Sinn Féin, it seems like quite a clever move to make that point, because one imagines she will just go ahead and form her government anyway, but they will say, well, we had this quite noteworthy objection, and so if it doesn't work out, ultimately they kind of come out on top, or they can say, well, and actually I think it's a good position to be in if they are, which they are, pushing for a vote on a United Ireland.
Anna, you want to get on this?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I've been thinking is taking rather a long time. And actually, you know, there have been rumours that Theresa May might be talking to the Liberal Democrats. Tim Farron has just stepped down as leader of the Liberal Democrats. Things might be changing there. You know, it's possible that
But
this...
they don't have enough votes. They don't have enough
They have
seats.
more than the DUP.
Do they?
Yeah, they have 12.
Oh, that would give the majority. That would
Yeah.
give-
So
They have
this-
said they'd never go into coalition
Yeah.
again.
Well,
That was Tim Farron.
that was Tim Farron.
Why, like last week, was that not a possibility?
I think Tim Farron made that very clear before the election. That was one of his commitments. One never knows what, you know, Vince Cable's emerging as a key player. Who knows? It just seems that the DUP deal isn't happening.
Now,
at the
a
moment.
DUP deal might be in our interest because DUP are very much in favour of a soft Brexit, and that would be very much to the,
But you keep
the
on
advantage
making
of
this
this
point,
country.
Vincent, but the
Okay.
issue of
They're
Brexit...
also
All right,
again,
we
the
got to leave
plan
that. That's it for now. For more on tonight's program, we're going to tv3.ie. Well, that's next. What's tonight?